on that note, everyone, so let's get started. So to start off this conversation, I would love it if you could put in the chat, just so we can get to know each other a bit, if we could put your name, what degree you're studying, your university, and what you want to be when you graduate. But I will also message that in the chat just for a reminder as well.
I'll type it in, Kaylin. Talk.
Thank you. Also, before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and their continuing connection to our community. We pay respect to them, the culture, to the elders past and present. As many of us are watching in locations all around Australia and New Zealand, I'd like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the country in which we live and work. I'd also like to recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and community and pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders, both past, present and future. So right now I am based in Sydney and I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Uluru Nation and the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. So in today's call, it's really exciting. We have Arian the Legend, the App Dev Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. It's a pretty impressive title. So this pretty much 45 minutes, I'm going to be learning a bit about him, his role, and expand. It will be mainly him taking the lead, but I am going to make sure in the last 15 minutes, last 20 minutes, we get our guest obviously asking questions as well, in case he hasn't covered anything. So quickly, our agenda. I'm just going to show you some MSA reminders and upcoming events. I'll introduce Arian, and then Arian will head on and kick it off, and then leave room for some Q&A. So there is a change in accessing exam vouchers. So what you need to do is, I'll make sure there's a post on LinkedIn in case you forget, but what we need to do now is go into the Microsoft Student Hub and scroll to the bottom to the student certifications page. And that's where you'll get your exam vouchers. And so again, as I introduced before, Arian, the Legend, and upcoming events, there's a few more, but here's 3 big ones. There's a Brisbane in-person meetup on the 21st, on the 25th, as someone requested, a SC900 crash course that myself and George Coldman will be presenting, and then December 16th, another monthly call. So that's it from me, and again, another ambassador panel. But that's it from me. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to let Arian take the lead. Yeah, so take it away. I will stop presenting. So maybe the first question is, I would love it if you could just talk about, you've got a slide deck. I will keep quiet and I'll let you take the lead.
I don't have too many slides, literally 2 slides to cover. But yeah, I thought I'll quickly introduce myself. Arian Nevjestic. I've been with Microsoft for almost 15 years now. I actually, let me introduce actually my family first. So this picture here is a recent picture from my family. My wife, obviously here, our newborn son, Matteo, who's now 4 months. Obviously our 2 original kids, the dogs, and our first child, Aria. Now, in terms of my interests, obviously technology has been a big part of growing up, exploring, tinkering, breaking things, fixing things. But on top of that, along this kind of tech side of things, a bit of a audiophile as well. I love my music. I love speakers, amplifiers, tinkering with that type of stuff. And another hobby which I've had to kind of park for a bit now with kids and stuff is obviously the cars. I used to love, I obviously grew up around the Fast and the Furious sort of time, and had a lot of different cars and got to explore a lot of different parts of the world as well when I was younger. In terms of my education history, so you'll probably notice I have an accent actually. So I was actually born in Bosnia and immigrated to Australia in '95 at the end of the civil war that occurred there in the former Yugoslavia that broke up the multiple countries. And yeah, basically lived in Perth since 1995. Completed uni in 2006. Now, what I decided to do was computer science. I was dead set, like, this is what I want to do. Absolutely, no one could change my mind. My parents are, doctors, dentist, and a surgeon. No one could convince me to go and try and touch that type of field. Why? Since I've come to Australia in '95, that's the first interaction that I've had with a computer. Essentially, it was like an old, I think it was like a 286 or a 386. It didn't even have Windows. It had DOS, and I had no idea how to operate this thing, right? So one of our friends that actually gave us this computer just wrote down on a piece of paper a couple of commands and preloaded some games in there so I can actually have some excitement using this machine. So slowly, from changing directories, copying files, and those type of commands that he kind of shared, I slowly started learning. Oh my God, like you can do so much on this thing. Obviously, didn't have internet at the time, but very soon I basically upgraded that computer to something that ran a graphical interface operating system, and with that also got internet. So I was basically hooked from 1995, which I would have been 10 at the time, early age. And I was really curious, like, how does all this stuff work? Like, how come I move my mouse and I can see a pointer on the screen move? And how are those pixels actually changing? And when I open this application, how does it know that, I'm about to click print and the print actually produces the same output that I've just seen on the screen? And from that curiosity and with the help of internet, obviously web was also becoming a thing. I actually started building little apps that were not web-based at all using Turbo Pascal because it was free at the time. And I got an illegal copy of Visual Basic 6. So one of my friends copied that on a CD. And I started playing with VBC because it was so easy to build like a graphical interface and actually get something to respond in there. My dad is also a bit of an audiophile and he used to borrow a lot of CDs to his friends, and half of the CDs would never make it back home. So one of the things he set out to me when I was like 10 or 11 was like, hey, why don't you build like a little program so I can keep track of all my CDs? So again, I used VB6 for that. Figured out now there's a whole database layer thing. And slowly from that moved more into the web, starting off originally with HTML. But then I got more curious. I'm like, hang on, how does the client interact with the server? It goes over this, mystical sort of network. There's a whole TCP/IP stack in there. There's HTTP, HTTPS. There are web servers. So basically, at that point, I still haven't touched much of Microsoft stuff. I got on a lot of the open source bandwagon, predominantly because it was free, accessible, and there was a lot of documentation online. And yeah, started basically building websites and, some sort of administration pages, forums, those type of things. Anyway, so yeah, by the time 2003 came around, when I had to kind of decide what I want to do for uni, it was pretty much an easy choice, computer science. And at the time, networking was a big thing. I think we've got Mohit here on the line, who's a networking engineer, I assume. So I decided, why not? Let's combine those 2 degrees and get like a double major out of it. Now, once I finished uni, basically my first job was Fujitsu Web Solution Center here in Perth. It doesn't exist anymore. Obviously, company Fujitsu is still around. Essentially, what it was a consulting company with a bunch of web development skills inside of it. So it was actually quite scary coming out of uni and starting in that job. Everything that I've learned at uni around good software design practices, testing, unit testing, white box, black box, all of that stuff, performance testing, all of a sudden that all got compressed, right? I started getting on these like little, we didn't really follow agile methodology, but we still ran like on a 2-week kind of sprint to knock out features as quickly as possible. I was working with Java. I didn't really have any senior devs to kind of like help me out here. So every check-in that I was making, and was the first time I was actually using a version control system, Subversion at the time, I was like terrified. I was like, what's going to break? Luckily, we still had like dev, test, and prod environments, so you could kind of lint out your changes. But nonetheless, I learned a whole heap on that first job, Web Solution Center. Somewhere around 2007. And by the way, I wasn't knocking out complete features back then. So don't be scared as well if you're studying software engineering. Your first job, you probably won't be expected to build the entire product end to end. They'll probably start you off with things like, fixing the bugs backlog or something like that, so you can get familiar with the product, with the way the team works. And then once you kind of master some of that skill, then they'll probably start asking, hey, all right, well, there's a whole new sort of user story. Go and actually knock out those 4 features that are associated to that. So yeah, I definitely learned a lot. We definitely had a lot of sleepless nights, lots of really bad deployments that broke things. Our customers at the time were, public sector customers. W Police was one of them. Fisheries in Perth was another one. But we've also just signed on a contract with Woodside, which is, a pretty large mining company here in Perth. And that was a completely different experience. Basically, Woodside was completely, almost fully a Microsoft stack. And overnight, I had to basically almost forget everything that I've kind of become comfortable with and learn all these new things about Microsoft, .NET. SharePoint was a big thing at the time. And basically in 2007, I started working on SharePoint on an intranet that Woodside had originally written and rolled out production worldwide without the product even being generally available. So they actually didn't even wait for it to become released to market at the time. They used like some public preview of this stuff. So you can imagine lots of bugs in the product, lots of bugs in the custom code that was running there as well. And again, lots of sleepless nights. But nonetheless, I would say, honestly, Fujitsu was probably one of those companies that I really learned a lot and actually built quite a bit of confidence, both from consulting perspective, because, hey, when you're a software engineer, you're not really just writing code. You're having to understand, break down requirements, understand what the overall goal of what you're trying to do actually is going and whether it's actually going to meet customers' requirements. So with that, I basically, I loved working for Fujitsu, but an opportunity came up in Sydney. A role came up basically as a premier field engineer, which was a new role at the time. And I thought, you know what, given that I've already kind of established a bit of a contact with Microsoft, I used to raise like on a weekly basis, multiple tickets, support tickets to them. They kind of liked me, but they also hated me because I was never satisfied with their response. One of the guys said, why don't you just actually apply for this role? It's actually a graduate role. It will be a good fit for you. And I did. I got really motivated. I went back home. I basically rewrote my resume like in 2 hours. I was so motivated, submitted it. And basically the week after I had my first interview. I didn't actually consider like, hey, you actually have to move to Sydney if you were to get this job, because I honestly thought I wouldn't actually get this job. So I went with it, and I think it was actually a good thing to think that way. I know everyone should be positive about it, but the reason why I think it was good is because I wasn't actually nervous at all. I just, gave it really my best shot. Read up a lot, obviously prepared a lot before the interview, and really, yeah, smashed. I really walked away from it thinking, you know what, I've really given it 100%. If it doesn't work out, then it's meant to be. And it was like 3 months. I didn't hear back from Microsoft at all. So I thought, nothing's happened. And then all of a sudden, my mom actually called me. For some reason, Microsoft didn't call my mobile number. Instead, they called the landline number. And my mom was at home at the time and picked up, and they basically told her I got the job. So it was a big surprise. It was a really good surprise. I picked up my bags and basically moved my life into Sydney. I was 22 at the time. My girlfriend came about 6 months later to follow my footsteps. And yeah, basically the idea was, you know what, I'll give it a shot for 2 years and I'll come back to Perth. I was a bit of a, typical Eastern European guy, attached to his family, his parents. They meant everything to me. And, the thought of staying longer than 2 years away from them was a bit like, oh, I don't think I can do it. But I actually really loved my life in Sydney. Met some new friends. The first day in Microsoft was actually a bit of a weird one. Nothing was really ready for me. My card didn't work. The laptop that they've given me was like some hand-down laptop that was like 5 years old already. It could barely run Vista at the time. And the office was quite old. I expected the office to look a bit better, given that, hey, this is Microsoft after all. But the team that I worked with, it was really like me, right? A whole bunch of males and females. We had quite a few females in the team as well. Passionate about technology, passionate about, really getting a nice outcome for the customer. So what did my role entail? It was a technical role, but it was predominantly proactive sort of support. So The product that I had to take care of at the time was SharePoint. I only really had about a year worth of knowledge in there. But because of the projects that I ran at Woodside, we really pushed the boundaries there quite a bit. Even though it was 1 year, the product was fairly new. So 1 year was already a good enough sort of experience. And that's what you'll find in tech in general, right? You see these people that have had 20 years of experience. Cool. They bring definitely some cool and good angles to the job. But don't be afraid coming out of uni. You guys come with a fresh sort of pair of eyes, and that's really important. Humans, they're hard to adapt, right? They're hard to change. So, new set of eyes, new set of ideas is what companies are looking for as well. Not just, this is how we've done it on Oracle in 1995. So yeah, my job was really looking after SharePoint. I had a lot of kind of projects working on leading edge scenarios across most of the customers around Australia. So it really opened my eyes into what is the insurance business about? What is the banking business about? What is the mining business about? Most of the mining stuff I actually picked up when I moved later in my life back to Perth. But it really kept it exciting, right? I was never really bored in that job. And SharePoint was a huge product. Like, it touched on so many aspects. You could customize it, you could tweak it. It had a search component. It had like this whole application ecosystem. It had its own like deployment engine as well. So you could stage your deployments out and send them across. So when I started already in 2008, there was already talk of cloud. We used to get support tickets where people were running stuff on Amazon, and we'd be like, oh my God, like, it's so slow, the disks on Amazon, that's your problem, right? Amazon at the time was also AWS, sorry, should I say, was at its inception sort of services. They were also learning from customers how to run this thing called the cloud. Around 2010, I remember lots of announcements, lots of emails in Microsoft around, hey, this thing, Red Dog, is now formally Windows Azure. And I gave it a shot. I tried to run some of the customizations for SharePoint on those layers, and it was really a brilliant platform. It started off its life focusing really, because we were competing, with the AWS. We wanted to take a different lens into what the customer experience should look like for a cloud. And really, what we were pushing for back then was, hey, let the developer really be productive by being a developer and not having to care much about networking, infrastructure, disks, VMs, and all that type of stuff. Now, in hindsight, we kicked ass in the PaaS side of things. But what was really happening was the market wasn't really ready to shift into that PaaS space just yet. So many apps were written to still run on, sort of aging infrastructure, and so many software projects and vendors didn't really understand how the PaaS stuff worked. So while we were, we had a great story, AWS was really eating our lunch with providing those infrastructure services to the customers that customers could quickly jump onto the bandwagon. The skill set wasn't a huge shift as well at the time. Infrastructure as code and all those things actually came a bit later. But yeah. So I got really interested in that space, and basically in 2015, I still remained a PFE, but I basically changed my focus area. Instead of being focused on SharePoint, which was really exciting and cool, I thought maybe it's time to kind of move into modern apps. So what did modern apps mean? It meant helping customers basically build stuff on Azure, developers onboard them onto Azure, and really show them like, how do you actually write code that's actually distributed, because writing code that runs on a single server versus writing code that actually runs on multiple servers is a completely different challenge. It comes with its own different set of problems. First of all, yes, you've got networking in the mix, and most people here would go, but you've got a network load balancer. Its role is to kind of send one traffic bit to one server, then another kind of call to the next one. And that's true. However, Netflix of the world, Facebook of the world, and all these big, companies that were born in kind of the cloud, they've marketed so many and they've built so many cool concepts, right? Like blue-green deployments, the ability to test out features really fast and roll them out, basically roll out incomplete code into production, but only allow 5% of users to kind of see it. get some telemetry, learn from it, and then double down on that feature. So really getting a lot of that. Now we're getting into kind of the DevOps feedback loop, but getting a lot of early telemetry signals so that they actually, they don't have to make these big bets, right? That they'll throw a couple of things, users will decide what's useful, and then the developers will double down on those useful things and actually make it a super serious feature, rather than, guessing that this is going to be a hit feature and spending a lot of money and a lot of time, and then for it just basically dying. So with that distributed compute, I got into kind of whole integration, messaging. How do you engage one process to start up another, sort of spawn another process to do some unit of compute based on some event? So event-driven architectures were a huge thing around that particular time. And basically spent some time in there. 2016, our first daughter was born. And obviously that triggered off a move to Perth. I basically moved end of 2017, but I put here 2018, I moved to Perth. And very soon after, I actually became what I'm in right now, which is a cloud solution architect role. It was a relatively new role at the time. I didn't really understand it. All I knew was, hey, I'm part of this like customer success unit, and my job is to make the customer successful, which if you look at the role before and the role before, all roles were kind of customer centric, right? With the fact that, the value that you also bring in there is your app dev skills. So I was lucky to be one of the first App Dev CSAs here in Perth. We only have 2, so I can't really brag about it. At the moment, our team is about, 15 or 20 people at the moment. We are broken up into kind of 4 or 5 domains, core infrastructure being one of them. So if you're super interested in networking, how compute works, storage, scaling those things out, firewalls, identity, and a bit of security, that's a cool area to be in. That's a cloud solution architect in core. App Dev, so just jump maybe to the next slide. So what does my normal day look like? I work essentially with customers or partners that are working with our customers. I help them bridge, kind of business problems to technical solutions. I help poke out challenging bits of the code that is, putting the project potentially at risk or the customer into some sort of unease into going ahead further with that particular project. We modernize and work with these customers a lot around taking their old legacy apps and turning them into more modern things so that it does run on those PaaS services that I was talking about earlier. And that usually implies, what I call a bit of an open heart surgery. We take a system that's live and in production, and we essentially, start ripping things out like authentication, which is a critical part of most systems. We decouple it away from on-prem systems. We now couple it and marry it up with Azure AD in Azure. Obviously, we rehost the app as well inside Azure. Usually, it's not just a lift and shift. Again, we would probably have to make some code changes in there because a lot of these legacy apps will have kind of exposed secrets hard-coded in the code that probably have some older dependencies. So we'll probably try and lift them up to more modern sort of libraries. Logging is usually a problem as well. They're used to just logging stuff onto the disk. Although you can still do that in the cloud, there are so many more better options in the cloud, like App Insights, and getting much more enhanced telemetry out of those things. So that's kind of like modernizing legacy. But the really cool part, I think, of my job is the whole cloud native apps, where we get to kind of, really play with the leading edge stuff. We combine, as you can see in this picture here, we combine quite a few different services in Azure to make up that solution. It's no longer just a web server with, some front end and back end. We break up these layers such that each of them can be released separately, tested separately, scaled separately, and more importantly, once you start decomposing these components, how do you communicate between them? We start using message queues or event hubs to basically respond to events. So you might have, one component of the app that says, hey, increment something in a database. Instead of going and actually talking into the database directly and incrementing it, it just raises an event. and then you have something that processes that event. And the beauty of these type of architectures, yes, it adds more complexity, more moving parts, definitely operationally can become a bit of a challenge. But the beauty is the thing that responds to these events, you can scale one or more instances, right? And that's what I'm saying. Like when you build stuff for the cloud, you get to build these type of architectures, which are really cool. And at the same time, like we have to balance out the traits of building something really cool and leading edge with the skill set that is in that operational team, so that they want sort of support. Typically what happens with software developers is they write code and then it gets shoved over to the other side of the fence, operational side. And then, it can be a bad experience. The solution could start failing and the operational team is not really prepared on how to kind of tackle that app or how that app even really works or how to monitor it. So another part that I raise here is obviously observability. So we try to bake the operational challenges that we foresee into kind of the design principles when those cloud native apps are built from the get-go. So we try to really embrace distributed tracing, and we try to build dashboards for telemetry such that the operational team can be a bit more successful and ready once they do start taking over those activities. Integration is a big part of my job. So a lot of people go, how hard can integration be, right? It's, let's say I need to integrate a payment platform with a bank, right? CBA or something like this. Well, yeah, the idea of, it just needs to call this other thing is pretty simple. But once you get into these business critical systems that again need to scale and they need to be online for like really high sort of SLAs and SLOs, it can be quite a challenging thing to solve for, right? Yes, you have these technologies like message queues and event hubs and Kafkas and all this type of stuff. The thing is, they're just technologies. And as a software developer, you got to embrace the technology, use it what it's good for, but then build on top of it layers of abstraction and actual business logic that will actually make it a worthwhile use case for your actual, outcome that you're looking for. So if you take that scenario of a payment platform, what happens in a scenario where, okay, you publish a message to say, hey, I need to pay X amount of money, right? It goes on the queue. At the back of that queue, the subscriber will actually go pick that up and actually go to the mainframe, let's say. That's maybe what happens at the bank. And it will go and adjust the ledger, right? Now, what happens if that mainframe is offline or that mainframe is under high load and it doesn't actually respond quick enough to the thing that's trying to insert? The time has passed, right? And you might be minus $500 in your bank account. But it's not really reflective. The system is still allowing you to spend more money because the minus 500 hasn't really occurred in the backend. So that's where these problems arise. You need to start becoming quite creative with how you event source these things. How do you retry these things? How do you build these materialized views such that those other systems start reflecting the reality, even though a mainframe hasn't actually, the source of truth hasn't actually caught up to it. The other thing is, like, if you try to retry the event, what happens if eventually the other event makes its way through? Now you're going to have duplicates, right? So how do you deal with those scenarios as well? So these are all kind of integration problems that we try to deal with. And, these problems exist everywhere. It's not just these banking scenarios. If you look at the mining industry, they have a whole heap of telemetry coming off trucks, mine sites, drills that they're putting in there, sensors out of tires. All that information is worthless potentially if it's not near real time flowing into the system. And now if you start adding in, let's say, machine learning algorithms and those type of things, time is of the essence. So these architectures become really, really crucial. On top of that, obviously, if there are product issues, we are kind of that feedback loop into our core product engineering system. We're probably the best placed to provide this product because we directly deal with these products day in, day out, and we really push them and stretch them to the limits with our customers, right? So what might work for one customer with the same product, we might actually hit some threshold limits with another customer. So that's another part of our role. And we are there also to upskill our customers. So there's no point in just kind of doing this work and walking away from it. We want to make sure our customers kind of remember some of these patterns and architectures so that they can then run on their own as well. On top of that, we are really tasked with winning the hearts and minds of developers at Microsoft with the Azure platform. And what does that mean? That means, obviously, yes, our tooling. We're a big tooling provider for developers, but we also have fierce competition. There's lots of other providers, there's lots of other languages. And you'll notice here, even though I'm a Microsoft employee, I'm not just a .NET sort of person anymore, right? When I was in that SharePoint space, this was my only sort of language that I was really using. Nowadays, I've had to expand my horizons, go back to kind of my uni days where I started with Java. Node.js came around as well. Python, it's huge as well. So we have to be a bit more agnostic on the frameworks as well. Because in the end of the day, we just want to allow you guys to be successful with whatever code you run, as long as it runs on our platform, right? With COVID, obviously, remote teams have always been a thing, but with COVID, it's definitely become a bigger thing. Developer experience is really crucial, right? How do we make the bridge of a developer entering and touching these type of services easier, right? So that's another thing, and that's what I'm putting here as scaffolding. So we can set up templates that can accelerate the developer's experience in Azure. And as part of that template, we can also kind of set up a whole framework for developers so that they can't do silly things. So we can set up policies on the branches for the code that they're checking in. We can pre-template out CI/CD pipelines. We can set up certain tasks to run in these pipelines so that we have some nice governance around the code that's actually progressing through the environments. And another big thing, obviously, is this DevSecOps. So when I first started, development's always about reusable code, right? You don't write the string manipulation logic, right? You take that comes with the library. But with that comes some risks, right? Because you're now having to implicitly trust somebody else's code that you bring into your project. And with so many open source libraries, and of course, unintentionally or intentionally, there are always going to be bugs in software. And bugs equal also security holes. DevSecOps is a huge thing, right? So developers are now also tasked with, that's why there are lots of tools as well. So it's not a big cognitive overhead. But as part of those build processes, there are tools that basically lint out libraries such as GitHub Advanced Security and all those features. They lint out a lot of these open source libraries for known vulnerabilities, and they continue to scan that on every check-in, right? Which is a big change from when you look at the stuff that was kind of built even in the late 2000s, even 2010. People would put ancient libraries that have a lot of security vulnerabilities. They wouldn't know about it. It's not their code, therefore they don't really have the source code. But in reality, their code is now affected by the weakest link, which is the dependencies that are in there. So yeah, we definitely try to teach people around the importance of DevSecOps and really embed with teams and embed this culture of how to actually build stuff the right way. So I know we only have about 10 minutes. I did a lot of talking. I think I might maybe open it up for Q&A. So we can have a fluid conversation there.
Yeah, and also, team, feel free to message it in the chat as well if you're a bit too intimidated to turn off mic. Absolutely okay, and I'll read it aloud.
I have a question to start off with.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy.
If that helps. So my question was around how do you stay up to date with all of these technologies? Because the graph that you're on screen at the moment, there's a lot there.
There is. And honestly, I believe in this thing called, so in .NET, you have this thing called just-in-time compilation. I have just-in-time learning, right? So that's what I was saying. My early job, this one here taught me the skills on how to become more of a consultant, which means that you don't know all the answers, but you have enough confidence and you have enough basis to kind of draw conclusions pretty quickly. So once you master kind of that skill, the customer is actually going to come with really interesting propositions and projects and asks. And sometimes they're going to be ahead of the curve. Like they're going to be asking for things that you've never done before. But that's when you embrace that thing of like, okay, I trust myself, I can learn this fast, and you just go for it, right? And there's no better learning, honestly, like reading docs and doing that type of thing. Some people learn that way. I find myself, I'm more of a, I'll read docs when I hit a problem type of thing. So I'll attack it from that angle so I can get some quicker sort of results. You'll get that sort of nice comfort inside of you to go, oh my God, I'm actually making some progress here. And then when you hit a bit of a roadblock, you refer to documentation and then you kind of connect the dots and quickly move on from there. But yeah, I mean, technology, regardless if you're a software developer, I think it's in every business these days, right? Everything changes at such a fast pace, unless you're a lawyer, right? That thing is like got precedents set hundreds of years ago. You do need to have that core open mind to say, I'll never be an expert in anything. I'll never know everything 100%. But that's okay. I'll know the ways to kind of get to the answer. Yeah. So networking, I mean, I did networking with my bachelor degree as well, right? I thought I was pretty deep there, right? I knew the OSI stack, I knew each of the layers, I knew most of the protocols, how they work, the sliding windows, the retry logic and all that stuff. Yeah, and then you get into the workforce and then you hit another issue and I'm like, I've never heard of this. So, you know, it's a continually evolving thing. Yeah.
Wait, anyone else have a question? Maybe while I wait for another question. Just in general, what made you choose this degree? Not degree, job.
Job in Microsoft or in general?
In general, yeah. Why tech? Why CSA? Why App Dev? Why?
Yeah, so I think my natural, I always used to break apart things. And then that's how I learned. I always used to reverse engineer things, right? So that was always my curiosity point. I'm not good with hands though. So that's my other weakness. You know, I loved cars, but I couldn't do anything on the cars. I had to pay always somebody to do something there. What I realized and what's the magic for me with software is it's like an art form, but it's also like a science, right? So you don't need to have these like hand skills. You don't need to be an artist to draw like a perfect picture, but you can use your scientific part to kind of draw, okay, this needs to happen and this needs to happen and this needs to happen. And I was really in love with the fact that you can kind of like tell the computer some instructions and it will repeat them perfectly every single time, right? So for me, that's why I kind of picked software engineering. I ended up in this CSA role by accident, really, because I was already in Microsoft and I looked for another role that gave me software dev experience as well as customers. I could honestly not just be in a dev team and not talk to customers, which is why I'm not in the product team. But I couldn't be just talking to customers and not doing coding. So for me, that CSA role is the only role that really makes sense for me right now, because it gives me both. Because the trouble I have with if you're just in the dev team, in a product team, you're knocking out one feature after the other, and that's all you know. You only really know that one product. But when you've got lots of different customers, they all have different ideas of how to do stuff. And that keeps your job kind of exciting as well. You're not just waking up and building another CRUD, you know, create, read, update, delete style app. Yeah. You're doing something else. You know, you're having this challenge with like, oh my God, this customer has this telemetry, but the problem here is not how they feed the telemetry, it's the transaction, you know, the transmission layer or the medium there is the problem here, right? They have mine sites where they don't have any connectivity. So how do you solve for that, right? So then you build some sort of caching layer or buffering layer where the device can kind of take those events and then quickly resync it once it's back online. I can see Mohit has a question.
Yeah, so I wanted to understand from what you just said that it is eventually that you having so much of experience, you can say that yeah, we need to go into all these directions, right? Having information or at least touch basing each of these technologies. But for a beginner, what would be your suggestion? If would it be right to be a master of one at first and then move on from that?
Yeah, I think so. But you need to then be careful when you pick the master of one, because when you're early in the career, you really actually don't know what's going to make you tick. If you pick something that you think you're going to be a master of and you end up forcing yourself to become a master of that, you're going to end up hating that job. That's the only issue that I have with that logic. So I would flip it the other way. I would try not to be a perfectionist at the start. I would try to rotate through as many different things as possible. So right now, I think you said you did networking and you did a bit of, now you're in a BA role and you said, oh, but look, I'm looking to get back into networking. So it sounds like you didn't really have a good experience maybe in BA role and you're looking back in there. But see, that's important because you've drawn that conclusion because you were exposed to those two roles. So exposing yourself to as many roles as possible is really crucial. I think the one role in IT that exposes you to multiple roles is, I think, support. I honestly think anyone in IT starts off in support because support, you are not a networking expert. You're not a app dev expert. You're not an infrastructure expert. You're not a security expert, but you get hit with all of those things and you get to experience a lot of those flavors.
Yep.
And a lot of teams, start off with that. And, some people, they're like, oh, I don't want to have this title of a support, support X person, right? Don't care about titles, care about the experience you get out of each of your roles, right? For me, cloud solution architect, it sounds like a pretty, like, wow, architect, role. I couldn't care less if it was just rebranded to engineer or, consultant or whatever, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's the work that defines you, not the title.
Exactly. Yeah, and just really try and experience it and just be curious. Ask how and why, and try to learn on your own. And the beauty of support is you can't make it any worse than what it is already, right? They already have an issue. They're calling out for you for help. So the worst you can do, you can't go more backwards than the situation is already, right? So you kind of got free kind of cards to make it better. And yeah, you can use that to learn about different things.
Agreed. Because sport will let me know, at least give me all those options right in front of me on a table, from where I can choose where I need to go again.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes
And
sense.
most companies kind of start off with that. That's kind of their logic as well. And they usually graduate programs rotate you around every 6 months. I know with like mining companies, you move every 6 months to different teams, so you get that exposure.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, but I mean, if you know right now that networking really makes your mind tick, then definitely give it a shot as well there. Don't shy away from it.
Yeah, BA is only to get my PR.
Okay.
That's the only way I can get my permanent residency and the citizenship. Once I move into that sphere, I'm supposed to jump back to what I was doing.
Okay. So it sounds like you already kind of know where your passion lies.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. I think we're on time. I don't know if anyone else has any more questions.
There's one in the window there that's a little bit the same, but also a little bit different in the chat.
Oh, okay. I didn't see it. So from Ankit. So for fresh graduates, what's the best approach to get started since they lack experience? I think just get your first job. I think that's the first thing. Don't worry about the lack of experience. Honestly, you'll be so surprised. Like I used to take naps after my first job. I come home at 5 p.m. I used to nap at like till 6 because I was that mentally exhausted. It was just information overload. Don't take a job in like bloody, Woolworths as a cashier. Go take a job in the thing that you've just finished. And trust me, companies are going to push you hard. And you're going to just naturally learn anyway as part of that.
How did they get that, Arian? See, the question is, should they be doing more projects, doing some open source stuff? What's the best way to sort of get picked? So
definitely these days, try to contribute to some open source things. The problem with open source is it can be a bit overwhelming, right? If you come and you're like, oh my God, this guy's code looks so clean and it's like so broken up into so many different classes and all that stuff, you might be a bit intimidated to even do a pull request on there because to you, it just looks like perfect stuff. So that's the danger with that. If you can maybe find something niche that you're passionate about and try and solve that in an open source project and don't care about the quality of your code, just push it out there and get some of those runs on the board. I think that's also a useful thing. Having your own pet projects, you'll get a solution working in like a really crappy way, and then you'll go, okay, well, I can make it a bit better, and then through that you're going to learn new things, right, by trying to evolve on that original idea, because you know what the idea needs to deliver really well. You're not going to have this problem of like constantly looking for a new problem to solve. You already know what it is, but you just look for a different way to solve it. So you might want to maybe write it in Python, and then you might write it in .NET, and then you might want to pressure test it and see where the things fall apart. And then you might want to kind of beef it up. And then as you beef it up, you'll probably learn new technologies. So it's the same idea, just built many times. Okay.
Even if you are worried about your code, or you're not coding every day, you can make your GitHub profile look well, more eye-catching than the others. I'm just pasting my GitHub profile in there. And you take a look at that. You can, use your GitHub like you use your LinkedIn in order to really showcase and catch people's eyes. And then I'm not coding every day, but I am coding sometimes, and then that's enough to sort of get you started and put you above other people. Yeah, definitely code in public.
Yeah, and the learning curve and experience, I think it's like really sharp first couple of years, and then after that it kind of tapers off, but you just become more smoother in execution later on in life. But the first couple of years, so you might say, oh my God, this guy's been 15 years in Microsoft, it takes 15 years to get to this level. No, it takes maybe 3 or 4 years to get to that level. The rest is like, you improve on other areas, your soft skills, your professional sort of skills, and those type of things. But yeah, I would say
you technical things every day, though. How
you do.
How many times they release new features in the night, and you wake up and you're like, oh goodness.
You do. But I think the 3-4 year sort of initial sort of learning curve builds you the resilience to pick up the new stuff, because the concepts are all the same, right? Once, in the end of the day, computer is an input-output device. But there's abstraction layers over it with message queues and other things, and that's the difference. But yeah, if you always go back to the first principles, it will give you the confidence to accept the change that's happening and the new features. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It was nice to speak to you all, and I'm sure everyone will have a blasting IT career. It's in hot demand, and as long as you're passionate, I think everyone can be really successful.